Good morning.
Good morning to today's program, which is L'Seicha Nishmas Rav Nachman, Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rabbi Nachman Klein, Zatzal. And before Mayor speaks about his father, I'd just like to say a couple of words. I knew Rabbi Klein longer than anyone here except for Mayor. When I was a young bocher in Baltimore, I came in 1969, so we were treated to Divrei Torah for Rabbi Nachman Klein in the dining room on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a time in yeshiva where everyone is up for the occasion and wants to grow in Yerushalayim and utilize the days of Yom Neroim to its fullest. And the Klein family would come and spend Rosh Hashanah on the campus, and Rabbi Klein would speak in the dining room. And when I think about it, he was really a young man at the time in 1969, but you wouldn't know it from the content of his talks. He was very erudite and very knowledgeable. He was a balabas. He was not a rebbe in the yeshiva. He had a business. He ran a business all day. But yet, he was Malei V'Gadish. He was chock full of Torah. He was one of the outstanding and primary students of his rebbe, the Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ruderman Zatzal. And we all knew in Baltimore that the Ner Yisrael is capable of producing tremendous Talmidim Balabatim, of course Rosh Yeshiva, but even Balabatim, it's very important for a bocher to see that no matter what they choose to do in life, but they won't be limited by their profession in terms of how much they can grow in Torah. And I would say that Rabbi Nachman Klein was that example of a balabas. One thing stands out in my mind is that it was a night of Purim, and the yeshiva divided into groups, and we went in cars throughout the city of Baltimore to raise money for Chinuch Atzmai. And then after that, we would return to the yeshiva, and then the band would play, and we'd dance from midnight till 4 a.m, and it was very, very, very Purim-dik, as you can imagine. And we knocked on the Klein's door, and I'll never forget, the house was dark. Rav Nachman answered the door. He was wearing a hat in the spirit of Purim with a cigar, and he had a Gemara Zvachim open. He was sitting and learning Kachim as if it would be any night of the week. In other words, that Purim is Torah Shebal Peh, and everybody could be merrymaking out there, and it doesn't make a difference. But I was impressed, and I've said this over before, how bocher is, we feel that we've got the monopoly on Purim. Yet this balabas knows how to really utilize Purim, and he was sitting and learning in his house. And then over the years when he came to visit here in St. Louis, so he inspired us with his many, many talks. What I'd like to say is one other thing, and that is the relationship that Reb Nachman had with his son Meir. We learned in the parsha that Yosef HaTzadik, he was able, even though he was severed from Yaakov in his relationship and in distance, but he always saw Demus Yokna Shel Aviv. He always saw the image and the visage of his father in his mind, and that the image of his father really influenced him and inspired him and informed him how to act in any given situation. I can't tell you how many times over the years that Meir and I have been here together for 30 years almost, and how many times Meir has always invoked things that his father's taught him, his father has said. Whenever he speaks, it's always something to do with his father or things that he learned from his father. So I just want to say that as far as Meir is concerned, that you are zeicha to have a father whose Demus Yokno can forever be etched in your mind and continue to be etched in your mind. And so I'd just like to conclude with saying that the words, the Divrei Torah that we hear today should be to his Zichras Nishmasai, and he should be a Meilei Tzosher for the entire Mishpacha, for the Klein family, for his wife, for the children, grandchildren, and for all of Klal Yisrael.
Thank you for the beautiful words. It's interesting. I was thinking that I speak often, but today I feel a lot more emotion. Just comes with the territory of a Yartzheit for father that I love so much. His two main characteristics that I think I've always taken with me and most people identify were his Avos HaTorah and his understanding of Masorah. He named me Meir Simcha after the Meshech Chochmah. Last night, I don't know if the rabbi was thinking about this, he said two Meshech Chochmahs over, and when we were going through my father's house, my mother, Menachem, still there, so my brother said to me, "You take Daddy's Meshech Chochmah. That's the most significant thing that you could take." And it is. He named me that name, not that I know much about Kabbalah, I mean very, very, very little, but there is something about when you name a child with the exact name of the person you're naming them after. The Baalei Kabbalah say that the idea is if you take the exact name, that there is a little spark from that first neshama that goes into the neshama of the baby. Whereas if you take a name and you modify it, it's still covered. It's still covered, but it's not. You don't get that neshama spark. So you could talk to Rabbi Nitzin, I don't know if he's here or not, but he'll explain that in a lot more detail. But and of course the Rav. But anyway, so that's what he wanted for me, and I'm sure as I think back, I feel very confident that I have let him down. But thankfully, this is not about me; it's about my father. So we can move on. His Avos HaTorah was great, but everything that he had was Masorah. He always understood that his Torah, the learning of Torah, had to be the Torah that he got from his Rosh Hashiva. When he was Nifter, we were working very hard to decide what to put on the Matzeva. And we were involving a lot of people. I asked Rabbi Greenblatt, and I talked to the Rosh Hashiva in Baltimore, and I talked to Rabbi Tzvi Berkowitz, and a lot of people were involved. And one of the lines that was placed on the Matzeva, the wording on the Matzeva was Torah's Avodas Levi, the Torah of the Avodas Levi, which is the Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Ruderman, that is the Torah that he learned and taught. As the Rav said, he was learning and steiging as a balabas for 50 years after he left the yeshiva. But he never, and he was mechadish all the time, but it was within the guidelines of what would be acceptable to his Rebbe. And it's a tremendous lesson, I think, for all of us, that we go and we grow and you leave the yeshiva, and there's a tendency sometimes maybe to think that you can do your own thing. In Torah, of course, I'm talking about in Torah. And my father always understood that whatever he was being mechadish, it had to fit with what the Rosh Hashiva would accept. It's interesting. We also put on his matzeva that he was a Talmud Muvak of the Rosh Hashiva. He was a dedicated, exemplary Talmud of the Rosh Hashiva. Rosh Hashiva was his Rebbe. And again, we asked a lot of people, can we really say that? And they said, yes, you could say that. That is appropriate for your father. I was reading, my father has a sefer, which hopefully one day we'll put out. I was reading it, and he says in the sefer, he says that he did not consider himself officially as a Talmud of the Rosh Hashiva based on one exchange, a private exchange that he had with the Rosh Hashiva. He was very close to the Rosh Hashiva. When I got to the yeshiva, it was a couple years after the Rav. The yeshiva was, you came in 69. It's always easy to remember. He was born in 0, so he was 69 years old then. But my father was in the yeshiva as a 47. Yeshiva was a much younger person, was extremely involved with the Bachram. So he asked the Rosh Hashiva, I want to be a Talmud of yours. And the yeshiva said, to be a Talmud of mine, the following is required. You have to be an expert in Bavli, in Yerushalmi, in Rambam, in Shulchan Aruch, and have gone through a minimum of 10,000 shilas and shuvas. That was the requirement. And I just read that the other day. It's right in the Sefer. That's what Rosh Hashiva said would be required to be a Talmud. So my father writes, he says, I never lived up to that. So I don't know if I can say that. I might say that if he didn't, I don't know, maybe he did. But if he didn't, I think he came very close. Came very close. Everything he had, his whole Torah was the Torah of Messiah from the Rosh Hashiva. But when he lived a Torah that was an Avos HaTorah. He lived the love of Torah. If you saw him speak and his face lit up when he was talking and learning, he had a tremendous Avos HaTorah. So I was looking through that Sefer, and I wanted to share with you two stories before I turn over to Rabbi Kowalski, two stories of Avos HaTorah. The first story is relating to the Ramah. The Ramah lived in Krakow. And he wrote a sefer on Esther, I don't know that it's that well known, called Mechir Yayin. Mechir Yayin, wrote the sefer from Megillas Esther. My father tells the story of how the Mechir Yayin got to be written. He says there was a plague in Krakow, and this plague was deadly. And people were leaving the city, it could not be controlled. It was a matter of life and death. The Yidden left the city en masse. All of them left with the Ramah together with them. It was Pikuach Nefesh, they had to leave. They left their homes, they left their possessions, they left most of their money. And it came time for Purim, and they were in this adjacent city, and they were not wealthy to begin with, and now they were somewhere else. And they did not have any wine for Purim. They didn't know what to do. So the Ramah said he's going to figure out a solution. So my father writes that the Ramah decided he's going to write a sefer. He's going to write a sefer on Megillas Esther. And he called that sefer Mechir Yayin, a substitute for wine. Because the Ramah understood that Purim you had to have simcha. And that simcha is accomplished through drinking wine. But there was no wine. So how is he going to be mesameach all his balabatim? And he could not afford wine for Purim. So Dr. Ramah, I'm going to write a sefer. I'm going to write the Mechir Yayin, a substitute for wine. And my whole kehila will learn that sefer. They'll learn that sefer and give such a simcha. That'll be the simchas Purim. That was my father. Zatzal, his face, you could see as he was enjoying learning and giving over the learning, it was that he actually didn't like wine. So it was Mechir Yayin. It was Mechir Yayin. It was a substitute for wine, the Avos HaTorah. And one more story. This is a story, Alan's here. My father says he heard the story from Rav Meir Tzvi Bergman, his Rav Shach's son-in-law. And Rav Shach heard this in the name of the Briskerov. Everyone knows that the Shagas Aryeh was known for his brilliance. If you learn in yeshiva, the Rav has said this many times, you read the Shagas Aryeh Svarim, it's just astonishing. The Chedushim, the Oras, the Kashas, are, as they would say in yeshiva, the Bam Kashas, they're so strong, and the Terutzim are just undo the whole Kasha. So this is the story. The Shagas Aryeh lived in extreme poverty. And apparently at the end of his life, he did have a little bit of financial means, but until he was in his 70s, he lived in extreme poverty. He was so poor, it's hard for us to imagine, but I see how the story is told with the most authentic sources. My father wouldn't write any story down until he authenticated the story. The Shagas Aryeh could not afford writing paper. He couldn't afford paper to write his Chedushim. So what did he do? So he wrote the Chedushim on the walls of his house. He wrote the Chedushim on the walls of his house. And he was so full of Torah that before too long, the walls were covered up. The entire house was covered up with Chedushim Torah. The Rebbitzin would come, take whitewash. Whitewash all the walls of the house. And the Shagas Aryeh would start again and start writing all over the house. And that was her job. She wasn't trying to get rid of it. She wanted to make more space for him to write the Divrei Torah. He was out of space. So the Shagas Aryeh had his wife lovingly whitewash all the Divrei Torah. And he started again. Frek the brisker of. How do you do that? You just erase the Torah like that? Erase Divrei Torah? This is, I would say, true Chedushay Torah, the Shagas Aryeh's Torah, you just erase it. So Brisker Rav said that the Shagas Aryeh had a need to externalize his Torah. He couldn't keep it inside. It was at the level of Pekuach Nefesh, Dr. Brisker Rav. For the Shagas Aryeh to keep all that Torah inside could have killed him. He had to externalize it. So he wrote it all over the walls and asked his wife to wash it off so he could fill the house all over again. And that continued on and on and on. That's the Shagas Aryeh. That's the love of Torah that he had. He couldn't live without externalizing that Torah. And that was my father's Torah. If you talked to him and you listened to him and you understood that to say over Torah was his greatest pleasure. I only conclude that, we, Baruch Hashem, are zeicha that as challenging as the world is, Baruch Hashem, we don't live in a time that there's rampant disease and poverty. The Rebbe always speaks, we have such an opportunity to learn Torah and to give over Torah. It should be our zchus to learn Torah and to teach Torah and to feel that love of Torah. I'm not saying to go home today and start writing all over the walls. It's necessary. Okay? But we have such an opportunity. We should take advantage of that and learn Torah and build Torah. May these words be Lila Nishmat His Neshama and a zchus for all of Klal Yisrael. And we should continue to grow until Mashiach comes in our time.
Amen. Amen.